Miss the ocean living here in Minneapolis. It is wonderful to have 14,000 lakes, but there's nothing like salt water and real belly clams. So it's nice to be amongst you. My mom said that it would be a short ride, a short drive to my cousin's house, because she would take a shortcut through this place called Cabbage Town, just outside of Atlanta, Georgia. As I looked out the window, searching for cabbages along the highway, I saw long, low houses on sandy red clay. I saw an old mill and lots of cars piled up in the front yard and women standing around and men playing in the dirt with their kids. This is the first time that I laid eyes on these people, and my curiosity kept my head pressed up against the window in the back seat. It was late, and my dad was finishing up his work in the office in downtown Philadelphia. And a man came up to him on Broad Street with tousled blonde hair and asked him if he could spare some change for him. Now, I stared in disappointment at my father as he gave him his loose change, the change that I had been asking for the previous hour. As the man walked away, I stared at him, curiously why this man was a beggar. My great-grandfather liked to tell stories. One day he was telling us a story about something that he looked to the adults in the room for affirmation, and he said, well, they ain't nothing but poor old white trash. And everybody laughed. So I laughed too. I didn't know what I was laughing at until many years later in South Boston. There I was working with at-risk white youth in public housing. This was during the days of busing, South Boston High School. And one afternoon, I went to the home of one of the kids I was working with on Thompson Island. And the mom directs me to sit down. And I look down and I see I'm about to sit on the whole front seat of a Mustang that was serving as a couch. I sat down carefully, as if I was traveling in a foreign land looking for the social cues to move in this very strange place. These were the people I brushed up against, drove by, and heard about. These were the other white people. These were the white people that I and everyone around me, both black and white, had nothing but disdain for. They were the butt of our jokes as we watched the Beverly Hillbillies and Hee Haw as kids that later morphed into Honey Boo Boo and Duck Dynasty. They were pop culture junk food that accompanied me as I chuckled at them drinking craft beer at art openings. These were the one group of people that my upper middle class family and friends of all backgrounds could agree that we were better than. Now, according to Nancy Eisenberg, the author of White Trash, The Untold History, 400-Year History of Class in America, my attitudes about this population had been carefully curated by the deliberate myths of noble Puritans, bronze statues, and the delusion that America is a classless society. Being born in Philadelphia, growing up and taking my first half of my adult life in Boston, this was an easy posture for me to take. These childhood fantasies and falsehoods about America's bootstrap options for white people over time gave way to the truth that this is indeed a class-based society. Long before Occupy Wall Street or Bernie Sanders, long before we were a country at all. In White Trash, Eisenberg takes a very particular look at class, and she does it in an exacting manner, examining the white outcast who politicians from Andrew Jackson to Donald Trump sought to rally and organize, but who otherwise have remained vilified, shunned, targeted, and kept apart, both physically in poorhouses and trailer parks, through eugenic sciences and discriminatory public policy, and in the nation's cultural imagination, where they have inspired mockery, kitsch, and unceasing grimaces and eye rolling. One of America's founding myths, of course, is that the simple act of leaving England and boldly starting new lives in the colonies had an equalizing effect on the colonists, swiftly narrowing the gap between indentured servant and merchant, landowner and clerk. Not true. We Americans were taught to believe that the New World was seen as a land of freedom and possibility. The truth is that it was widely viewed by those in England as unproductive wasteland, an ideal place to ship Europe's deplorables. While some Europeans did cross the Atlantic to seek religious and political freedoms, many more came as convicts, prostitutes, orphans, and indentured servants. In 1619, King James I was so fed up with vagrant boys milling around in his new marketplace that he asked the Virginia Company to ship all of them, round them up, and ship them overseas. 3 years later, John Donne, yes, that John Donne, that amazing poet, wrote about the colony of Virginia as if it were England's spleen and liver, draining, as he says, the ill humors of the body to breed good blood. Colonial America was a place where the surplus poor, the waste people of England, could be converted into economic assets. England's most destitute city dwellers were sent there, including tons and tons of children, shipped to the colonists in a practice known as spiriting, creating a class of white laborers that served as disposable property, including the story of one Elizabeth Little Bess Armstrong, sent to Virginia for stealing 2 spoons. 2 spoons. Our founding fathers had very little faith in the capacity of the white man. Benjamin Franklin, the poor white man, I should say. Benjamin Franklin opposed giving alms to the unemployed poor, fearing it would encourage them to be idle. Thomas Jefferson urged the creation of a uniquely American stock of hardworking, virtuous citizens, and thought that those who did not measure up were like livestock, he called them, unfit for breeding. Poor white people were seen as expendable, deserving of scorn. They were called waste people, offscourings, lubbers, bog roggers, rascals, rubbish, squatters, crackers, clay eaters, tackies, mudsills, scallywags, briar hoppers, hillbillies, lowdowners, white niggers, degenerates, white trash, rednecks, trailer trash, swamp people. While hereditary titles may have gradually disappeared in the colonies, large land grants and land titles remained central to the American system of class privilege because capital and ownership determined the social pecking order then and today. White Trash, this book is a cringe-worthy history lesson, worth reading. A chronology of the caste system that has existed in our country since the first Europeans arrived on the eastern shores some 5 centuries ago. Second, it is an effort to explain why some white people seem hopelessly relegated to the lower rung of the economic ladder, a position that has much to do with cultural heritage as it does to do with financial resources. Now, finally, the book really is a cautionary tale about how poor white people are manipulated systematically and purposefully to be excluded from full participation in the society in which we live. Poor white people are reminded every day that Wall Street, Silicon Valley, Washington, D.C., and Hollywood can get along just fine without them, and that very few people are willing to make a genuine effort to get to know who they are or to improve well-being, except through manipulation. Thus, QAnon and Pizzagate, meanwhile, can proliferate. Meanwhile, their wages are stagnant, their kids' education is subpar, their water also is at risk of sudden chemical poisoning. Moms drink too much and dads are dying for what the Center for Disease Control call deaths of despair, a new category of death as a result of opiates and suicide, largely upon white middle-aged men. Poor white trash means unwanted, disposable, non-human. Now, whether we admit it or not, we have come to accept white trash as an inevitable thing, like the trash in our kitchens. We stick it as far away from our noses as possible so we don't have to smell it. Now, when I experienced a re-education in this book, while I experienced a re-education in this book, there were a few questions that kept me up at night that I want to share with you now. First question, why was I, this Black, upper middle class, educated, never been poor person, so interested in poor white people? Was it the gaze at Cabbagetown as a kid and the stories of my great-grandfather and the car seat couches that made me a voyeur, peeking into the windows of white poverty to understand why these white people couldn't seem to take advantages of reaping the fruits of being white in America? What's the matter with you, white man? Get it together. With every new fact of their oppression, I had a strange schizophrenic compassion for these people who were victims of the same system and ideology that exploits Black people. In fact, when I read that there was a movement to sterilize poor white women in the 1930s and serious academic attempts, I mean journals and conferences, to classify poor white people as a separate race, I smiled, dreaming that if more people knew this history, maybe it could spark the multiracial poor people's movement that Dr. King talked about. Because poor people's suffering is connected through oppressive policies and twisted beliefs. But that smile quickly gave way to my lived experiences of those angry white faces. And one angry white face in particular, a vicious face of that 15-year-old girl standing behind a 15-year-old Black girl. And I want to share that face with you now. Do you remember this face? Here it comes. You should be able to see it in a second. Does anybody remember this face? That's Hazel Bryant right there. This is 1957. That face. Walking to her newly integrated school in Little Rock in Arkansas, 1957. But now, after I started reading this book, I wanted to know who this woman was. So I did a little research and found that this white woman's name was Hazel Bryan, who in 58, the year I was born, would drop out of school, marry and live in a trailer. Her father was a disabled veteran, unable to work. Her mother held a job at Westinghouse plant. Neither of her parents had finished high school. Hazel was the face for so many of us of Southern white trash from that era. Ignorant, unrepentant, congenitally cruel. But the real story behind Hazel Bryan is that white elitists rigged the system so poor whites got slightly better schools, slightly better jobs, and slightly better homes than they were expected. And they were expected to defend those slightly better privileges against people of color, often violently. Poor whites ended up with the short end of the stick as well, but they fought in the knowledge that at least they were better off than the Black counterparts that got nothing. President Johnson, Lyndon Johnson, said something so telling about this, and he says, you could take the poorest white man and tell him he's better than the Negro, all while the banks are picking his pockets, and they wouldn't even know. I soon realized that my fascination with poor white people came from my early affiliation with the more radical UUs of Boston, the Communist Party USA, the Student Mobilization Committee, and the Socialist Workers Party, for I had a sincere and passionate desire to see a multiracial revolution develop in this country that would wake and shake these poor white people to join me and seek justice for all citizens. I have still not woken up from that dream. Second question that kept me up was pretty basic. Um, and I have to really preface this because this is serious stuff here. The second question that kept me up was, is it going to be possible for our country to reconcile any of these relationships? Are we going to be able to really see who we are? Think about it. Are we going to see who we are? I really want you to think for a second. Hold that thought. Now, another question. Why am I so unsatisfied with conversations that I have with white UUs when I bring up class problems in Unitarian Universalism? We rarely discuss it, and when we do, we often focus on the theoretical poor and the nameless homeless. When I advocate for the poor white man, I get strange, curious looks from white UUs. When I ask, why don't you bring your cousin you don't talk to because he voted for Trump to church? I get dismissed as being ridiculous. Why would I even say something like that? But we want to have Black people in church sitting next to us in the pews. As if these white people undergoing the travail of disenfranchisement deserve little empathy. Their inherent worth and dignity is not recognized. I have heard you use to refer to these cousins as layabout drenched in self-pity or described as sad cases consumed with racial status animus and anxiety towards non-whites, passing them on the economic ladder. Yes, that may be true, but while some of it is, the comments by my white, faith-filled, justice-seeking UU siblings are strikingly ungenerous, callous, and cruel towards a large number of fellow Americans. Unitarian Universalists like being allies to people of color. Some of us are armchair allies that watch Rachel Maddow and listen to Amy Goodman. Some of us are cocktail party allies that like to one up the liberal with the Merlot, with our Merlot comparing protest logs and financial contributions. And of course, there are those who have gone full in and immersed themselves in another culture to gain deeper empathy for the struggle and move into people of color neighborhoods, only to gentrify them through their tacit demands for goat cheese and better coffee at the corner store. Friends, can we reconcile the rhetoric of a universal free faith with the reality of our present class-bound composition and our self-serving and selective alliances? Can we empathize with the poor and working class, particularly the ones suffering from what Marx calls alienation? Think about it. If you are a craftsperson that's really skilled craftsperson, you like to work with your hands, you might be a UU. But if you make a living by renting your muscles and selling your time permanently, not just until your novel gets published, you probably aren't a UU. Each survey of our movement has demonstrated beyond question our peculiar class structure. We are, whether we recognize it or not, still tied to college towns and wealthy neighborhoods and communities, to dominant professional groups in this country. I would like to suggest that our class identity may be less of a result of wealth than it is the consequences of education levels that we've attained and value. But because we are a movement, I firmly believe that we can transform and evolve. We can get unstuck and we can reframe our positions to extend our beliefs to the inherent worth and dignity, whether we sit with them in church or not, but to extend our belief in the inherent worth and dignity of those white people we have never considered worthy enough to speak to or spend time with. When I sat on that car couch in South Boston, I realized how far the UUA headquarters was on Beacon Hill from these people's realities. The scope of the world for those in Southie was limited because of deliberate policy that kept them out of sight from the Boston Brahmins. But this UU did just not connect the sociological and political dots of their existence. I connected in relationship with this family. Yeah, they were shocked to see me come into their house. They were confused, but I cared about their kid. I listened to their stories. I ate with them. I drank with them. I laughed with them. Laughed with folks that were stereotyped as too racist, too stupid, too whatever to engage across race and class. More of us need to do this, and the good news is that the last couple of years, class conversations are emerging in our association, and that they are providing tools for us to use and examine class hegemony that keeps us from creating space for multi-class communities. It's called UU Class Conversations. They have a website, describes in detail how UUs need greater awareness of class, and they provide practical tools that a congregation can do to address these issues and assumptions. For they make some really clever analogies here. They pose the following questions like, does your congregation or do your committees require leaders to spend their own money and then get reimbursed for things? Real practical stuff, prohibiting people without money to be in leadership. Do your members start off asking the question, as I did growing up on the East Coast, which I learned not to do here in the Midwest? First question when I meet someone is, what do you do? Not who you are or hello. Does the water ceremony always have to talk about exotic places we've traveled to? Are all your meetings and events geared towards people with 9-to-5 jobs or retirees? How does someone with a 3 to 11 shift get to participate in the life of your church? People host things and people who have certain zip codes. Oh, well, I wouldn't go to that neighborhood for a meeting. And here's how do you speak about ethical obligations? Are you making people who cannot afford ethical eating feel marginalized? I'll never forget going into a church and watching, this is church, I was in the Midwest somewhere, I won't say where, and someone, a white woman, brought in a big thing of Folgers coffee to this church and brought it to the social hall, and she'd been coming a couple times. She says, yeah, I went to Costco, I got a big thing of Folgers, like to donate it. And I watched the people who ran the coffee hour say, oh, we don't use that kind of coffee. We only use fair trade. The look on her face, she took her coffee and walked out. Equality is simultaneously the greatest accomplishment and the worst failure in America. It is the place where idealism and reality come to blows in American culture. Despite the glossy veneer of liberalism, which has been painted over the rust and corrosion of centuries of racism and classism, the enduring American necessity for a social other has chosen working class whites as the focal skate point right now at our time. I want to remind us that our theological orientations has a vision to begin the world anew, every day. And this must be with all kinds of people, not just with the social circle we create in our like-minded liberal little enclaves. It must be practiced in an ever intentional manner in ever widening circles if our faith is ever going to be transformational, or if we're going to just remain a few and the fit, as was the term used about Unitarians. Perhaps this is how Unitarian Universalism can fulfill its democratic vision and become more than a faith for a few. But it requires us to remain conscious of our biases. Rather than having conversation about how we as haves can invite have-nots to share our churches, can we instead have conversations which say, this is what we believe all in our church should be able to do. Now, how do we make it happen? As we enter the next couple of years, this is a critical juncture in our country. We need to forget charity. We need to embrace new forms of solidarity to be transformed. And it's going to be very difficult and feels impossible. But that's what people of faith do. They take on the impossible. They don't remain comfortable. Our resistance as Unitarian Universalists must include our own transformation, both internally and externally. Our resistance needs to resist everything about the current ruling class, especially their exclusivity. As we challenge the Trumpian values of indifference, and we can't cherry pick which people to include and empathize with. You call them white trash, rubbish, rednecks, trash, townies, hillbillies, you call them Gary. from Ohio who dropped out of college because he couldn't afford it. Or he got frustrated taking remedial reading classes. His career choices of factory worker or bartender or busboy or retail clerk or gas station clerk, day laborer or janitor is not a reality of choice, is it? He is our neighbor, our brother, our fellow citizen, and his inability to make a decent living in his town is due to circumstances and attitudes and policies far outside his control that were set in motion hundreds of years ago, like they were for little Bess Armstrong. They haven't changed much since then. The veneer is different. The mechanisms, the logistics are different. But as you prepare to block or delete that relative, that cousin that you can't stand, you can't reason with, think about beginning the world anew by giving our UU values, our principles and sources a muscular and compassionate workout for the sake of our democratic republic before it's too late. It's really up to you. It's up to white people. Talk to your brothers and sisters. Blessed be. Amen. And Ashe.